This is the Farming for a Better Climate podcast. Hello and welcome to this Farming for a Better Climate podcast. My name is Séamus Murphy and I'm joined by Robert Ramsay. How are things, Robert?
Yeah, very well, Séamus. How are you?
All good, all good. So we've been looking at some of the kind of agricultural kind of sectors and how they've been dealing with the multiple shocks, I suppose, that have occurred over the last, or have impacted agriculture over the last kind of 12 months. Where do you think in general, I suppose, the agriculture in Scotland is right now, as we kind of, we've gone past 12 months since the war in Ukraine kicked off. So how do you think overall it's all looking at the moment?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and I think where I'm at for the whole industry is that industry wide, I think we're in a better place than we were this time last year. So at this stage last year, we were kind of looking at it like a new COVID, what is going to happen here, what's coming next, kind of brave new world, quite scared. Some industries did pretty well through that period, and others struggled a bit more. But I think where we've come to now is those that were performing really well, particularly thinking about the dairy industry, which was really really buoyant through that period, is beginning to cool off a bit. The heat's coming out the market a bit. Nothing to panic about, but certainly there's a change coming. And then the beef sector, which was a real struggle. So I think they're the two kind of extreme examples. Arable, I suppose, was also in a strong position, coming back a wee bit just now. But I would say on average, just now, most farmers are looking fairly favourably looking forward into 2023. And that's I'm certainly quite happy that we're in quite a good position.
Good. And we've already looked at beef in one of the previous podcasts, and now today we're going to try and take that kind of detailed view, we'll say, of dairy. And to help us do that, we've got Lorna MacPherson to join us on the podcast here. How are you doing, Lorna?
Yeah, very well, thank you, Séamus.
Good stuff. So as we kind of mentioned there's been a lot of shocks over the last 12 months or so that have kind of impacted the different agricultural sectors, we'll say, in different ways. How has the dairy sector been impacted?
I think in some ways it's been quite tough. I mean, farmers have obviously been faced with huge hikes in input costs in terms of feed, fuel, and fertilizer. But to be fair, I would say the milk price generally did keep up with the rises in input costs, and certainly probably more so in the latter half of last year. I mean, we saw milk prices peak at about 50 pence a litre for some contracts. So I think for those that were maybe on the slightly better contracts, there was probably a bit of money to be made. Yeah, I appreciate in some parts of the country, maybe the summer was quite tough. There was drought in some areas, not a lot of grass, but we had a wetter autumn, grass growth was better, and that maybe just helped reduce a wee bit of feed costs there and managed to get a bit more forage produced for the winter period. But I think they're starting to really get concerned about the way the milk price is heading now. So yes, fuel costs and fertilizer costs are now starting to drop a wee bit. Cereal prices have eased off, although protein costs are still quite dear in rations. I think going forward into the summer period, we will see feed prices come back a wee bit more, but at the same time, milk prices are now dropping quite considerably, probably somewhere down in the early to mid 40s at the very most. Sort of figures I've seen on cost of production over the last few months have been quite variable, but various sources put the average cost to produce a litre of milk around about 45 pence a litre. So when milk price was in the high 40s or touching 50, I think there was a bit of money to be made. But now we're seeing the milk prices come back. There's been quite significant cuts this month, and there's a few milk processors that have now announced further cuts for April. So we're probably looking at prices in the very low 40s going forward. And as we approach the spring flush, I think that's going to be a concern as well. If we do get a good spring, good turnout, and plenty of grass, milk volumes will go up, and as a consequence, we'll see that milk price come back even further. So maybe just a wee bit of a concern going into the spring flush at this time of year.
I think the stories I'm hearing are less concerning than they were. So maybe if you go back 6 weeks or a couple of months, they were really, really talking the job down big time, and probably scaremongering to an extent. But I think what we're hearing now is more like a return to normal kind of seasonality type, or there's a seasonal effect to milk price. There's going to be a glut of milk comes on in the spring, the price drops, but I think there is an expectation that the price will be reasonable, not necessarily good, but into the back half of the year. There's plenty things likely to limit milk production a bit, not least less farmers, less there are less people out there milking cows than there has been in the past. So who knows where it goes, but I think there are reasons to be more positive now than there was a couple of months ago.
Yeah, quite possibly. And if you look at the commodity markets for things like butter, cheese, skim milk powder, cream, we are starting to see just a little bit of stability there. I mean, the average or monthly prices have still been dropping into February from January, but the drops are not quite as big as what we saw in the latter part of last year. So we are starting to see a little bit of stability now to those commodities, which hopefully is going to mean that our milk prices are not going to drop significantly further. But having spoken to a few farmers, you get the impression that they'll manage okay if the milk price sort of stays around about 40 or early 40s. But if it starts to begin with a 3, then I think there'll be some concerns. It'll very much depend as well on people's systems. So for those that graze their cows and get them out to grass and can produce milk more cheaply, in the spring and summer months, then it's not going to be quite as tough for them. But maybe your higher yielding, high input herds that are housed all year round, whether they're maybe just feeling it that wee bit more.
And in terms of, I suppose, then looking at, I suppose, how kind of the shocks, the energy, the energy and kind of fertilizer fuel, how that could impact a dairy farm. What could farmers kind of do now to try and, I suppose, mitigate against any kind of potential shocks that may come if kind of the price drops back and the cost of production kind of stays high?
Yeah, so that's the worrying thing. If the input costs, don't come back much further, still remain quite high, but yet milk price comes back, it's really just trying to manage the herd as efficiently as possible. Certainly, we're looking at silage making time in the next 6 to 8 weeks. Really trying to maximize forage quality as best as possible. Trying to cut young leafy grass. If you can maximize the quality of your forage and improve that, then hopefully make more milk from forage, and whether that's got an opportunity to try and reduce concentrate costs as well. So really looking at the efficiency of feeding, because we all know feed cost is the biggest cost to the dairy herd. Other measures of efficiency, it's looking at fertility as well, as trying to make sure that we're getting cows and calf when we want to, and at the same time just not carrying any passengers in the herd, any cows that are just not paying their way. So anything that's not on calf by 200 days or really high days in milk, and got to look at the detail in these cows, for the milk they're producing, are they actually covering their feed or their keeping costs? So it's just really trying to do the best job possible, maintain herd health, fertility, and feed efficiently. So a lot of challenges.
But it's really nothing new. The challenges we've got now, the multiplier is different. So the milk price and the cost of production is much higher than it was in the past. But when things were tight in the past, we had to do all these things. And that goes back to parents, grandparents, loads of years ago. The key principles here were to keep things tight, make as best quality forage at home, and run that herd as efficiently and as well as you can. So there's nothing in the current setup we're writing bigger checks, we're dealing with bigger numbers, but actually this is nothing different. The only thing that's different here is from back in 2016 and things is doing it this time is possible. We've done it in the past where no matter how good you were, it wouldn't stack up. Whereas this time, I hope we have a year where the cost of production and the milk price aren't, worst case scenario is they're not far away from each other. And if we can shave and tidy, become more efficient or be as efficient as we possibly can, you've a fighting chance of making some money. And also that all ties into all the climate change stuff, all the carbon audit stuff. It all comes into just farming to the best of your ability and the best of the best use you can possibly make of the farm you've got.
Totally agree, Robert, 100%. I think, you look back to, was it back in 2016 where there was the milk price crash and farmers were really struggling, somewhere down as low as I think 9p a litre. This is nothing new, like you say, there's no silver bullet. It's all just about trying to make marginal gains in a lot of little areas, because a lot of the farmers that are left from, those bad times, they have had to tighten their belts. They have had to be a lot more efficient. And so, like I say, there's no silver bullet. There's not one big thing. It's just trying to make small marginal gains in lots of different areas. And one of the things that's maybe quite a big challenge as well, and it's one thing we've not mentioned yet, is labour. And it doesn't matter where you go in the country, a lot of farmers will say their number one issue is labour. It's a real struggle, and it's the cost of that labour as well.
There's a lot of sizable farms in the southwest and then right down into England, big, often called super dairies, but big commercial businesses where they have empty cubicles, where they've never had empty cubicles before. They're milking less cows than they were, simply because they cannot get the staff to get the milk out of the cows. And it's a major worry, and it's an industry-wide worry actually, is where is the farmer of the future coming from? Because we know the farmer, being a farmer is not, or having farmers is not optional. We need people to do that type of work, and somehow we've made it unglamorous. It's something that's, it's dirty, unglamorous work. But if it's not there, if we don't have someone doing that job, the whole food story, the food story in the supermarket's becoming very relevant already. It's in the cucumbers and lettuces and that part. And in some ways, a food shortage is never you can never frame that as a good thing. But hopefully we've had a wee shot across our bows this early spring to see that actually, if we don't value food, if we don't value food and farmers, there are going to be empty shelves and there are going to be unsettled people and create issues, so that we do have a major issue. I'm conscious that is a tangent here, but it is a huge issue you brought up, Lorna, and I don't know how we fix it.
I think it's important that it is off kind of, I suppose, off piece to what we would usually talk about on a Farm for a Better Climate podcast. But I think that it's good to touch on it, and I suppose the question would be how can that labour shortage be solved? Is there a case for kind of increased mechanization, or what can be done to try and make the situation better?
I'm kind of guessing here. I think it varies a lot, maybe depending on the types of dairies and maybe the size of the units. And the bigger dairies are maybe more likely to have more structure in place for their workers in terms of the hours that they're working, holiday entitlement, but also maybe training opportunities as well, and a sort of a career progression path, whereas maybe some of the smaller dairies just don't really have the option to maybe be able to provide that sort of structure or career progression as well as some of the bigger herds.
But then the problem, if you can flip that problem on its head as well and say that so the Ayrshire dairy farming model is now about kind of 300 cows, family farm plus a worker or two. And if the worker doesn't show up some morning or the worker leaves, the family can then make the decision, or have to make the decision, just to work harder. And it's a horrible place. It's not, these guys are running super hard anyway, but everybody can do every job. Whereas you go to the big dairies, and if the guy that doesn't feed the cows, the guy that feeds the cows doesn't come to work, or in a scenario where there's no capacity to get the cows fed. So how do you know, if you've got a staff of 15, each link in the chain is more, it would appear that, they would appear to be less important, but actually the business is running so hard that actually if one or two of those people don't show up, there's a major, major issue there, and people can't just backfill it with their own, another, rather than working 12 hours a day, let's work 15 hours a day. It doesn't work on that scale, so it's a real challenge. And I think historically we were getting, in pre-Brexit, we were getting a lot of Eastern European workers, and there was at that stage, culturally, the Eastern Europeans were coming and wanted to work hard. They wanted to make money and send it home. We now, obviously, there's barriers. There's political barriers to that, and there's also, I think, there's a change in mindset in Eastern European workers as well. They've become very, very much like our current workforce. So we almost have to go further afield to get more people, and that you can only go so far until you start coming back round the world. So we, I think we have to start making this a better, more attractive workplace for domestic workers. We have to somehow get people engaged with dairying and engaged with good hard work. And actually, I mean, there's capacity for a lot of hours and making a lot of money out of a dairy farm as a worker.
And do you think that building in a story, that kind of story that I suppose the environmental benefits, building in kind of the improving carbon efficiency and sustainability across the dairy sector, we'll say, do you think that could help to kind of attract more people to kind of work in the industry?
I think it would help at the management, maybe at the more senior level, at the herd manager, farm manager type level, definitely having that. If you're a young person going to uni or just left uni and you're looking for a lifelong career, knowing that the business you're going to work for is sustainable, playing their part, working hard to produce quality food and do their play their part in the whole environmental question and whole environmental discussion, I think that would be a more attractive place to work. But there are also lower skilled jobs there that are probably that's less of a priority, and maybe the conditions that Lorna was referring to earlier and the benefits of working for that business, the team, what it's all about is probably more important for those guys. But certainly it's not something, I don't think anyone would discount it at all. I think it's hugely important.
Yeah.
And if we go back then to the discussion where we talk about the kind of individual farm business and how they can build resilience to kind of, you spoke about the crash in 2016, or like how farm businesses reacted to that, and how you can kind of build that resilience to potentially future shocks. It does all come back, or well, it doesn't necessarily directly come back to, but it all has a really positive impact on the carbon emissions associated with a farm business, if you can kind of really, really narrow down and improve and increase efficiencies across the board. Does that do you think that kind of chimes with farmers now, that kind of, that there is that the improving efficiencies builds resilience and then also has that positive impact on the carbon side of things too?
I would totally agree with that. I think if you go back maybe a few years and you started talking about carbon and carbon footprint, there wasn't a lot of interest, I would have said, really in the farming community about having to do these carbon footprints, and it was almost just seen as a tick box exercise to satisfy your milk processor, your meat buyer, whoever it was you're selling your produce to. But now I think farmers are really a lot more engaged with having to do carbon footprints, because they can see that any improvements in efficiency will reduce the footprint, but at the end of the day, you improve your efficiency, you'll be improving the bottom line as well. So there's definitely a direct correlation between reducing your carbon footprint, improving efficiency, and improving profitability.
So through that 2016 milk price bad point was when we were having our Woodhead climate change focus farm at Newmills, and it was very interesting, or looking back, it's very interesting that we were probably a bit ahead of our time with having a focus farm to do with climate change, and we had reasonably good attendances throughout, but we had one meeting that I was quite, and with good speakers for it, a couple of good speakers, and it was called Carbon and Energy on the Dairy Farm. So basically a bit about carbon auditing, not too much, and then a lot about doing an energy audit, looking at reducing electricity use for cooling milk. All this, where's the carbon benefit, but was mostly driven by the financial benefit to the business. 4 farmers went to that meeting, and I now look at it. It's only 7 years ago, it's a wee while ago, but if we had that meeting now, I think we'd have to book tickets. I think we'd have so many people engaged in it, and just it's amazing how the story has evolved. So when we were in the 2016 bad time, we were focusing on margin, we were focusing on cash flows, keeping people in business, and that was the main priority, and remains the main priority. Is profitable businesses are essential. We can't do anything with businesses that aren't there. So but now the story has come right round that actually when we do a carbon audit for a dairy farmer, it's almost a 50-50 split as to what the priorities are, the cash flow, the cost of something, and the impact it's going to have on their emissions per litre. That we've come a long way in a short time.
And do you think a lot of that is still kind of, I understand the farmer is kind of interested themselves and are kind of seeing the links between the carbon and the kind of bottom line, but do you think it's still kind of a lot of it is being driven by the milk buyers? I know that there's a lot of kind of engagement between the milk buyers and the farmers.
Yeah, so I think the dairy's further forward in the climate change story because of that. I think that conditions that have been put on a lot of these guys, not all by any means, but a lot of these guys now have to do a carbon audit and have to benchmark that against others, and that certainly brought them a long way. But I truly believe that farmers care about their impact on planet, on the local environment and the global environment, and I think they were dragged kicking and screaming, many of them, when it came to doing their first carbon audit, but they're generally more enthusiastic about their second or their third one, because they can see, as long as it's a good news story, but if they can see some progress, there's no financial reward for that progress at this stage. Probably down the line there will be, but our stance is, let's get to where, let's make some progress now and tick boxes, make you some money, and be in a better place for when that carbon story, the carbon auditing story, is likely to get a bit tighter and a bit more conditional.
I think when it comes to looking at livestock enterprises as well, I think the dairy industry really needs to hold its head up and be proud of how efficient they are in terms of their carbon footprint, because not only are they producing milk, but a lot of the dairy farmers, they've maybe got beef cross calves as a byproduct as well that they're producing. So in some ways, in terms of their environmental credentials or their carbon footprint, they're almost streets ahead of the suckler guys that are just producing, one calf each year. The dairy, they've got their milk to spread their emissions over, and then they've got the added benefit or bonus of the output of potentially a beef calf as well from the cows that they're not breeding their own replacements from. So I think they've got a lot of positivity that they need to shout about. And again, I think the dairy guys have been very much so at the forefront of looking at doing carbon footprinting from probably quite an early start. They've seen the benefit of it, and some of them are maybe feel like they were forced to do it, but I think now we're getting to the stage where they're going back to do a second one or a third one, and like you say, they're hopefully they're seeing the benefits, or they're hopefully seeing some gradual reductions in their carbon footprint and getting the benefits in terms of efficiency.
The one, I mean, I totally agree, and I think the dairy industry probably of them all. Certainly, if you go to looking purely on efficiency, you look at the poultry model and you look at the pig model and look at growth rates from feed conversion efficiency and things, but the dairy industry is dealing with a lot more than there's it's a more complex system they're running, and certainly over the last even 10 years, the progress in the dairy industry has been colossal. The only thing I think I wonder is where we're going to be in as our understanding of the whole climate science develops, is where are we going to be in terms of what's driving those. So the major improvement in efficiency has been the increase in milk yield. So we've got generally when I started with SAC, we'd have a few herds, a couple of herds that were doing 10,000 litre averages, and they were remarkable. That was a big, high yielding, amazing achievement. Now most people who are milking cows, so there's exceptions to that and exceptions to that for good reason, but there's a lot of people out there doing 10,000 litres and a lot of people doing significantly more than that. It's the how we get those extra litres, and if those extra litres are being driven by banging in bought in feed from anywhere, from all over the world, there's a question I think the dairy industry will get asked going forward is about their overall environmental footprint. So when it comes to sustainable soya, sourcing sustainable soya, we've started that process is ongoing, but there are questions. I think the dairy industry should hold their head up high, but they shouldn't shy away from criticism or shy away from making further advancements, making even better use, or making even more progress in this sector, because we're never on this journey. We're never going to get there. We're always going to be pushing more and more for efficiency, and we just need to be careful we don't land up buying litres using lots of crude oil.
I think that's a really good point. I suppose in some ways we have to think about, when we talk about carbon footprint as well, we're talking about emissions intensity, aren't we? So kilos of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilo of milk output. So yes, you talk about high yielding herds have higher input costs and maybe higher levels of purchased feed, and generally a carbon footprint on the dairy. We're looking at up to about 70% of emissions can be coming from enteric fermentation, so methane, but also from purchased feeds as well. But at the same time, we have to remember that generally the emissions intensity or carbon footprint per kilo of milk generally tends to be lower with the higher yielding herds. So it's not necessarily, we can't necessarily say that maybe the higher yielding herds and more purchased feeds is worse than our more extensive grazing systems, which rely less on purchased feeds. It's not always clear cut that one system is better than another for their environmental credentials or carbon footprint. And I think it all comes down to efficiency in a lot of different areas of the different systems that we have, because our dairy industry is so varied from 5,000 litre herds that are grazing extensively with very little concentrate input, right through to, like you say, 12,000 litre herds plus that are very highly reliant on purchase feeds.
It kind of, I suppose what I'm saying is kind of the dairy industry chased milk yield in the 90s. In fact, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, they were using pretty blunt genetic indices to chase milk yield, and they got loads of milk and they got loads of problems along with it, fertility problems, feed problems. And as our understanding of the genetics in the dairy sector improved, what a revolution we've had in the overall dairy cow of today, which is a much more functional, useful animal than it was 20 years ago. The climate change question, it's things like soya, palm kernel, things like that may have a net result in reducing overall emissions intensity, but also has a deforestation, biodiversity, globally significant story. So I'll be interested. I'm looking forward with interest to see where we go with climate change science and environmental footprinting going forward. Because certainly I think the dairy have got there with regards to, or are blazing a trail with regards to CO2 equivalent emissions. But are we comparing apples with apples?
The key thing to take away there is that although it's key to look at your carbon footprint and your carbon audit and try and take action to reduce that, that shouldn't be done at the detriment of everything else, or even in terms of the wider environmental impact. So when you kind of mentioned soya, Robert, if that soya may have a low carbon footprint, but if it's coming from, if it's deforestation soya or something like that, we shouldn't ignore the wider environmental impact of this kind of thing. And we have to be, as an industry and as a country, we have to be aware of, maybe it is better to have a higher emitting animal that is being fed on predominantly, UK sourced, or more kind of more locally sourced, we'll say, feedstuffs, as opposed to a low emissions animal, but the feed stuff has a significant impact on, we say, biodiversity or water quality on the other side of the world. And I suppose that's kind of the thing that we have to be aware of in this whole story. Okay, we'll finish up there. Thanks very much for joining, Lorna and Robert. For more information on the topics we discussed in this podcast and loads of other topics, please visit the Farming for a Better Climate website, and you can listen back to all of these episodes of the Farming for a Better Climate podcast on the Farming for a Better Climate website and on Spotify and wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.